Over the course of his 40-year career, Johnny Carson became one of the most famous hosts and actors. From the 1960s to the early 1990s, he was the king of late-night TV. The famous talk show host has had many interviews and conversations with famous people, but he is famously unpopular with one famous person in particular. Today's film will talk about the guest that Johnny Carson couldn't stand, as well as his supposed faves. This is a chance you shouldn't miss, so keep watching. Before we get to the million-dollar question, we should talk about who Johnny Carson is. John William Carson was born on October 23, 1925, in Corning, Iowa. He was born without a father. Ruth Elizabeth and Homer Lloyd Kit Carson had him in the middle of their family. When he was 8 years old, his family moved to Norfolk, Nebraska, where he grew up. Carson has been interested in and good at the performing arts since he was a child. And performing magic is the best thing for kids to do, right? That's what Carson, 12, did when he found a magic book. The next thing he bought was a magician's kit. He quickly put it to the test in front of his family and friends, starting with a game of chance. His parents, especially his mom, always stood by him. She even sewn him a cape to wear to his shows at the Kiwanis Club in the neighborhood. He did his first show for $3 when he was 14 years old. After that, he had a lot more shows very quickly. Carson was already famous when he was young, so it looked like fate had already made up his mind. It cost him $1.50 because he tried to hitchhike while claiming to be a midshipman. He joined the U.S. Navy on June 8, 1943, and was sent to the Pacific with the USS Pennsylvania, which stopped his rise to fame. He was a communications officer during the war and was in charge of reading encrypted messages. He also had an impressive amateur boxing record of 1,501. He could be someone. Carson kept putting on shows, though, and even said that doing a magic show for James V, U.S. Secretary of the Navy, was the highlight of his career. Forrestal was the best job he had ever had. He learned something important when he realized that even he could make the grumpy and charming Forrestal laugh. After the war was over, Carson chose to go to an L and join the Phi Gamma Delta fraternity, where he also did magic. After that, he got $1.25 for each performance. A few months in, he switched his major from journalism to speech and acting because he wanted to be a radio person. Carson started his job as a radio host at WOW Radio in 1950, after getting his degree. Soon after he started hosting The Squirrel's Nest, a morning TV show, it was clear that Carson had promise, even though he was new to the field. His career took off very quickly because of this. After that, he was the host of the famous but low-budget Carson shows Johnny Carson Show and Who Do You Trust? After he did well on Who Do You Trust? NBC asked him to host The Tonight Show until Jack Paar left, but he turned them down. Many people, including Parsons, turned down the chance because they had too much work to do, like 105-minute interviews. In the end, NBC was able to sign him in February 1962. What came next was a story of what happened. Johnny Carson was the host of the show that used to be called The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, until May 1992. People like Jim Carrey, Ellen DeGeneres, Eddie Murphy, and Andy Kaufman got their start as stars because of Carson's work on the show. Carson has talked with a lot of famous people on his late-night show. Still, there was always one person the host didn't like. Comic who was born in the UK, Bob Hope. Bob Hope is an accomplished actor who has been active for over 80 years and is famous for his comedic skills, acting skills, and making skill. Did you know? Hope hosted the Oscars 19 times, which is more than any other star. This American performer with British roots did it all, and lived to be 100 years old. Even though his real name was Leslie Towns Hope, he was still very well known. Bob Hope was born on May 29, 1903, into a poor family. To make money, he started doing stand-up comedy, singing and dancing on the streets. He was the sixth of 7 kids. He could do a lot of different things, and like Carson, he even tried fighting while wearing a suit in Impaki East for a while. In 1921, Hope was working as a worker when a tree fell on his face and hurt it badly. He had to have surgery to fix the damage. In later life, this gave him his unique look. Before he started doing radio shows, mostly with NBC starting in 1934, he had a busy early career in vaudeville and Broadway shows. He was in movies from 1934 to 1972, but it wasn't until the 1950s that he really took off when he started hosting his own TV shows. People who saw him perform and people who liked him praised his one-liners and comedic timing, and he was seen as a pioneer in American stand-up comedy. Hope was famous for making jokes about himself that made fun of himself. He would often start by praising himself and then finish by making fun of himself. In spite of all that he has done and achieved, Carson never got along with him, especially as he got older. He's just a funny guy at heart. There's plenty of proof that the famous talk show host didn't like Bob Hope, but Johnny Carson never said out loud that he didn't like him. The big problem that everyone knew about wasn't brought up until a certain book came out. The History of Bob Hope, sometimes called the Entertainer of the Century, was written by Richard Zoglin and put out by Simon Schuster. Because Bob Hope was on The Tonight Show so often in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of people thought he was one of Carson's favorite guests. But things aren't really like that. Carson didn't like him at all. The talk show host had a good reason for not liking Hope, even though he did respect him. In the beginning, Hope always looks the same from the outside. It's like he's going through a deep spiritual process. The comic would sometimes sneak off stage as the credits were rolling, showing up as a surprise guest on the show. After that, he would crack jokes at Carson for a short time before showing a clip of pre-recorded highlights to get people excited about his next show. Hope always seemed to be on the go because every time he went on the show, he left right away. You can picture how tired everyone is, especially the host, since this skit went on during all of his shows. Carson and Hope had a lot in common. They never really worked together or were friends, though. Carson respected Hope's place in the entertainment business, but The Tonight Show producer Peter LaSalle said that Carson wasn't a big fan of Hope's work. These two men were NBC's biggest stars back then, and their comedy styles were exact copies of each other. Carson's comedy was more polished, but Hope's was more about current events, with jokes about the news that didn't take a political stance. The second one could also improvise, which he lacked, especially when he was hosting Hope. The latter's routines were written by his team of writers, and Hope's obvious lack of improv skills made it even clearer that he couldn't come up with funny things on the spot. They were enemies in a way, since Carson knew that Hope was the only other star on NBC who could challenge his power. Hope, on the other hand, was on a high, because she had been NBC's big hit since 1950. So Carson couldn't show that wasn't true. Pop culture references also say that Hope was the most popular radio star on NBC in the 1930s and 1940s. Carson disliked the other man for many reasons, one of which was that he almost always got to go on The Tonight Show without even a prelude, while Hope could do this with little trouble. Every time he wanted to sell something, he did that, and let me tell you, he had something to sell almost all the time. When Hope booked himself on the show, Carson's angry tone was something LaSalle remembered. But Carson would always say, "No, you can't turn down Bob Hope," whenever a director asked the talk show host if she wanted to say no. The comedian knew that Bob Hope was highly regarded by NBC leaders because he had helped make the network famous. But to keep things friendly between them, NBC gave him the freedom to appear on the show whenever he wanted. Had to. Carson didn't like it when Bob Hope showed up at the last minute. Also, even though the comedian's memory started to get worse as he got older, the show went on as planned. In order to keep up the act, Hope gave Carson a list of questions that he wanted to be asked. The questions had to be asked exactly as they were written on the list, with no room for creativity. Hope's biographer, Richard Zoglin, wrote in the comedian's autobiography that Hope's hearing and vision were getting worse over time, making it harder for him to make guest performances. Because Johnny had a hard time understanding Carson's questions, he had to be very careful to follow the notes his staff had given him. If he asked the question out of order, Hope might answer it in a different way. It was only normal that Carson was upset about this because one of his many strengths was getting his guests to talk and making jokes on the spot. Carson wrote a book about his time with Bob Hope in which he said he hated the interview because it was so planned and detailed, including a long list of Don Teeson's jokes and how the show's numbers would drop every time Hope was on it. Also won't listen to Tonight's Show producer, Carson's nephew Jeff Sulzing, and wants to use 5-minute highlight clips, even though Sulzing told him to stick to 2-minute clips. Honest to goodness, Johnny Carson has been in a few well-known fights, including ones with wealthy Joan Rivers and Wayne Newton. But Bob Hope would have to be his least favorite guest, with Bob Hope being the other one that stood out and moved him and his fans. An important guest on tonight's show was fellow artist and singer Frank Sinatra. Remember that Sinatra didn't do many interviews, and when he did, not many people were brave enough to ask him questions. People rarely get to see Sinatra make fun of someone, but when they do, it's usually on the Tonight Show couch with Don Rickles. It only made Sinatra feel better about himself, which let his true personality show through. It was all good and did no harm. Drew Barrymore was thrilled to be sitting on the couch of The Tonight Show when she was 7 years old. She had wanted to meet Carson for a long time after being in Steven Spielberg's E.T. She told the talk show host that meeting him had been her dream for a long time. In 1976, the well-known radio host and filmmaker also made an interesting show on the guest. Wells proudly said that he thought radio was the best form of entertainment because you had to pay attention to the speaker. This is an example he used to talk about people who watch too much TV and don't pay attention to what's being said. What Wells said is true, and we can see proof of it now. One of his most memorable TV performances was on The Tonight Show, where he joked and laughed with Carson. The Tonight Show also had the pleasure of having American actor and comedian Robin Williams on. He seemed to be very smart, even though he was still young and still building his skills. His boundless energy made it even better. Many people will always remember his visit on Carson, even though he was on other variety shows as well. At the time, Walter Cronkite was one of the most famous American newscasters of all time. In 1982, he talked to Johnny Carson about his life since his last show. Cronkite's visit was also educational because he and Carson talked about the problems with TV news at the time and how objective TV reporters should be. Cronkite was thrilled to be a part of the show, and he and Carson both laughed at the pain of a new reporter's last day on the job. Along with Bob Hope, American actress Joan Rivers was a guest on The Tonight Show more than 90 times. If you believe Mix.net, Rivers quickly became one of the most popular guest hosts because of how well the other guests liked her. Over time, she built her own TV network and stopped going on Tonight Show. She supposedly told Carson right before her show started that she was going to start her own.